Yes, hello. After discussing the first subtopic in our topic, that is colonialism in Africa, that we discussed about the scramble for the partition. So now let us proceed with the other subtopic, that is Berlin Conference. So as we see, it is a conference. So what does this mean? What was that? This was conference which was called and attended by most of European imperialist powers, and this was after having the sign of the occurrence of the war. So in order to avoid the occurrence of that war, they had to call that conference. So Berlin Conference was prepared so as to divide the African continent amongst themselves after having the intensive scramble about the African continent. So that intensive scramble created the sign of having the Great War. Now, in order to avoid that Great War, they had to prepare this conference. So let us now discuss about the Berlin Conference. So this was the meeting which was called by the German Chancellor Edward Otto von Bismarck in Berlin from 1884 to 1885 in order to divide the African colonies amongst themselves in peaceful means. So as I said, it was a meeting, and it was a formal meeting, but this meeting was called by the German Chancellor, and this Chancellor is called Edward Otto von Bismarck. It is Bismarck who decided to call this conference, or to prepare this conference, so that they can reach in the peaceful division of African colonies after being experiencing intensive scramble. So this intensive scramble made the total signs of the occurrence of a Great War. Now, in order to avoid the occurrence of that war, they had to decide to have the conference or meeting. And this conference was attended by many European powers like Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, British, and others, while USA attended as an observer. So this conference was prepared and attended to the most of European imperialist powers, imperialist nations, simply because we are the ones who participated in the scramble for and partition of Africa. So themselves were the one who participated or attended to this conference. And this conference was held in the capital city of Germany, that is called Berlin. That's why the name itself is Berlin Conference. So I think even in the primary level, standard 3-4, we studied this, that is Mkutano wa Berlin. So this Mkutano wa Berlin now is this, the same topic. So I think we know it. We know it since it is not a new idea for us. It is not a new term, or it is not a new thing. We had been discussing at the primary level. So now let us check objectives of Berlin Conference. Why did they decide to call this conference, to call this meeting? So the conference had the numbers of objectives. Let us now discuss those objectives. The first objective was to solve conflicts or quarrels amongst themselves. For example, we have studied that during the struggle of African colonies or continent, there were numbers of conflicts, there were numbers of wars. For example, they fought for Congo Basin, they fought for Niger. We also had those wars like Franco-Prussian War, the war between French and German, that by that time was called Prussia. So now there was a war atmosphere amongst themselves. That's why Otto von Bismarck had decided to call or to organize this meeting so that they could solve those problems, those conflicts, those quarrels or chaos that rose up amongst themselves. Another objective was to divide the African continent in peaceful means. So they decided to call this conference so that they could divide African colonies, African continent amongst themselves in peaceful means. So Ottoman claimed that there was no need of fighting themselves because of Africa, since Africa was so large, was too large continent. Many colonies were there. Okay, let us settle. Let us have a table negotiations. Let us make that negotiations. That's why they decided to call this conference so that they could divide the African continent amongst themselves in peaceful means, since they were the one who were in case or in charge of African colonies. Another objective was to create permanent boundaries of African continent, and this was amongst of the good ways which could avoid war occurrence for colonies. Since before that time there was no special boundary, or there were no boundaries which separated from one colony to another. So they decided to create or to have this conference so that they could divide the African colonies. Then after, they could make boundaries, permanent boundaries, which separate between the German colony to British colony or French colony and other imperialist powers. Also to abolish slavery and slave trade in Africa. So they decided to prepare this conference so that they could discuss the best ways on how to abolish slavery and slave trade, which was much conducted in Africa, and to establish the so-called legitimate trade, simply because this slave trade was not profitable for them. So it just like it created a loss for European interests. So since slave trade was acted as a barrier for European imperialist needs or purposes, they had now to call themselves so that they could discuss only the basic strategies that they could use to stop this slave trade which was conducted in Africa. So this was another objective of preparing Berlin Conference. Another, to implement effective control of African colonies on how, after being partitioned, after being possessing those African colonies, how could they colonize African, how could they rule those colonies effectively so that Africa could accept, whether peacefully or not, to be ruled by colonialists. And this was not only during that colonial time, even immediately after independence. That's why up to this time, most of African colonies are under neo-colonialism. So neo-colonialism was prepared at that time. The other objective was to discuss about potential areas found in Africa. They discovered that African continent has those potential resources, harbors, minerals, those ivories, and other agricultural products. So these were potential resources for them. So they had to discuss how could they utilize those potential resources for the longer time. We call it sustainable use. How could they manage sustainable use and sustainable exploitation of those potential resources which found in Africa? So these were objectives of Berlin Conference. So let us now proceed with those principles of Berlin Conference. So let us proceed with the principles or resolutions or agreements reached during the conference. What did they agree during the conference? Principle number 1 was the principle of notification. They agreed that any imperialist power to own colony in Africa should inform his or her fellows so as to avoid quarrels or conflicts amongst themselves, since they discovered that amongst of the challenge which were faced by that time was since there was no principle of notification. But they claimed after having this principle, it could reduce all conflicts, all quarrels, all intervention. For example, Germany to intervene a British colony, Italy to intervene German colony, since they have already notified to each other. So principle of notification was amongst of the agreement which reached during the conference. They also agreed to abolish slavery and slave trade. They agreed that any nation, any imperialist nation, while during the colonization of Africans, has to abolish slavery and slave trade and to introduce the so-called legitimate trade, so that to maximize their profit and to be in a system of imperialist world. So they just wanted to turn African economic system or the total ways of system into imperialist system of life. Another principle was principle of effective occupation or control. They agreed that once they come in Africa, they have to occupy, they have to control Africa effectively without regarding whether it's they're like other humans. So they just agreed that Africa could not be prized or could not be felt like their friends. So they have to colonize the African effectively. Another principle is the principle of freedom of navigation. In this, they agreed that all navigation areas like seas, oceans, rivers, lakes have to be free for any European imperialist power to pass. Whether this part or this sea is in part of a certain colony or a certain imperialist power. For example, Tanganyika is surrounded by Indian Ocean. So even if Tanganyika could be German colony, those navigable areas around Tanganyika could be free or is supposed to be free for any amongst themselves to pass through. Another principle was that King Leopold was allowed to rule Congo, but Congo River was left to be a free zone for all nations, since it was amongst of the navigable place or area. Another was principle of disarmament. They agreed to reduce the production of deadly weapons as well as number of soldiers, so that they can protect the world peace and security and to avoid the occurrence of the big wars. So they claimed that once they start or they make this disarmament policy, could be the best way to maintain the world peace and security and to avoid the occurrence of. So significances of Berlin Conference. 1. It solved the international rivals amongst imperialist powers. As we saw, during the struggle for African colonies, many conflicts, many wars, many rivals occurred amongst the imperialist powers. So after this conference now, after having the peaceful, then we say it solved international rivals, international quarrels, international wars amongst themselves, such as Congo. There was a conflict of Congo, Egypt, Niger, and others. It speeded the partition of Africa under the principle of effective control. So the partition of Africa after the Berlin Conference, they had to mark firstly partition of Africa so as to implement the principle of effective control of African colonies or continent. It reunited European nations after making peaceful agreements. So during the scramble for independence, we saw that most of European imperialist nations had just like a conflicts amongst themselves. So they were disunited. But after this conference and making peaceful agreements, then their cooperation become new, or it reunited now. So those countries became reunited after having the conflicts, a lot of conflicts for the African colonies. It marked the colonization of African colonies up to interior. Since after this conference, the next was partitioning process, and after partitioning process, they had to introduce colonial rule. So the colonial rule now was colonization of African continent. So Berlin Conference opened the ways of colonizing African colonies from the towns up to interior. So even those interior places became famous in Europe. It created permanent boundaries in Africa. The conference made the creation of permanent boundaries in Africa, and those boundaries are the ones which are used up to date. If there is conflicts amongst the Africans themselves, they then turn to those boundaries which were created during that conference. So this is also a significance of Berlin Conference. So those boundaries were made during that time. Otto von Bismarck became famous to the world. After calling the conference, then this had a great significance to Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor by that time, who became very famous, very popular to the world wide because of the great thing that he has made. And this thing was calling of Berlin Conference. So Berlin Conference had much significances, starting from imperialist powers themselves even to Africans, as we have discussed. So after Berlin Conference, then they made partition process, partition of African colonies or continents, since they called this meeting so that they could divide those colonies in a peaceful means. So the next step is partition process of Africa. But today there is a quiz that is outlining 7 impacts of Berlin Conference. What are the impacts of Berlin Conference? What were the results of the Berlin Conference? So let us meet on the next session that we will discuss.
Purchase your tracks today.